Our project is on the financial burdens faced by caregivers of patients with life altering illnesses. The United States is one of the only developed countries to lack comprehensive countrywide legislation to provide job protection to informal caregivers that need to take time off work to provide care to their family members or loved ones who have suffered serious illnesses or injuries. The US presently has some legislation to provide some degree of protection to employees, including the FMLA, which gives eligible workers up to 12 weeks off of job protected leave to care for a spouse, child, or parent with a serious health condition. But the gap between what the law promises and what workers actually use is vast. To illustrate the gap between what the law promises and what workers actually receive, let's consider two hypothetical workers. First, let's consider Maria, a full-time resale associate who has worked for the same 120-person employer for 3 years. When her mother suddenly suffers a stroke, Maria is eligible for FMLA, and so her job is protected. Still, the FMLA does not require any form of wage replacement, retirement contributions, or financial support of any kind. Maria typically earns $730 per week, which comes out to roughly $2,920 per month, while her monthly expenses, including rent, utilities, food, and her mother's medication, total up to $2,800 a month. Maria presently has roughly 2 weeks of savings. By week 3 of her leave, Maria is taking on debt. By the time she returns to work after 8 weeks, she has lost nearly $5,840 in wages and accumulated thousands in new debt. While Maria was able to keep her job, the leave was still financially ruinous. For many workers in Maria's position, the mere thought of the possible financial burden means they will never take leave at all, even when the law technically allows it. Now let's consider James. James is a part-time warehouse worker whose father was diagnosed with cancer. James has worked for his 18-person employer for over a year, but he logs roughly 800 hours annually, which is below the 1,250-hour threshold required for FMLA eligibility. In addition, his 18-person employer falls well short of the 50-employee minimum. James does not qualify for FMLA at all. If he takes time off work to drive his father to and from chemotherapy treatment, he may lose his job. There is no federal protection whatsoever for an employee like James. Maria and James are not rare exceptions. They represent the structural reality of American caregiving leave. While the FMLA provides job protection, it does not require any wage replacement, retirement contributions, and thus requires employees depleting their savings, including by tapping into retirement accounts or taking on debt to stay financially afloat. Moreover, the FMLA only applies to workers who have at least 12 months and 1,250 hours for a given employer with 50 or more employees, which only includes 4 to 8% of firms, leaving as much as 40% of the workforce without federal job protection for caregiving leave. This means that workers for small businesses or companies, which account for the majority of Americans, those with part-time jobs, gig work, or unstable employment are unable to receive any federal aid for taking time off work. On top of this, federal law does not mandate that employees have the right to flexible schedules, reduced hours, or remote work in the event of needing to serve as an informal caregiver for family members. As a result, employers have the right to deny accommodations, cut hours, or penalize workers whose caregiving responsibilities conflict with work. There is no comprehensive federal ban on discrimination on the basis of family responsibility or caregiving, which leaves caregivers vulnerable to job loss or stalled career progression if an employee is in an inflexible job. Given that robust paid leave and flexible benefits are concentrated among higher wage, full-time, and public sector jobs, lower income workers, workers of color, and women, who alone provide two-thirds of unpaid family care, are all less likely to be covered and most likely to suffer severe financial consequences from informal caregiving.
In addition to legal limitations and policy, caregivers for patients with long term illness are harmed by cultural representations in the workplace. These structures deserve particular attention because they can operate without discriminatory intent and are embedded in widely shared organizational norms that many employers genuinely believe are neutral or even fair, which makes them especially difficult to challenge. Two overlapping norms are primarily responsible. The first is the ideal worker norm, which is the expectation that employees will always show up and give their full effort. This is justified by the assertion that they are under contract and paid for their labor. The norm has an understandable internal logic. Employers depend on reliability, and in many contexts, an absent employee creates real costs that fall on colleagues or the organization as a whole. The problem arises when the norm is applied without accommodation to employees managing caregiver demands that are, by definition, unpredictable and non negotiable. When caregivers deviate from this norm to attend to their ill family members, which includes driving them to appointments, monitoring them post treatment, or even helping with activities of daily living, they face status based discrimination, where they're stereotyped as less competent and less committed to their professional roles. Let's go back to James, whose only realistic option when his father began chemotherapy was to absorb the consequences of missing shifts because no legal protection existed to shield him. Every unplanned absence becomes, in the eyes of his employer, evidence of unreliability. Maria's situation illustrated the same issue, but from a different perspective. Even with FMLA protection on paper, the financial pressure of unpaid leave forced her back to work before her caregiving responsibilities had ended. The second norm is the flexibility stigma, the negative perception towards employees who use family friendly organizational policies, including reduced hours, changing schedules, or taking leave. The logic for the stigma is similar to that of the ideal worker norm, as a manager who repeatedly takes on the consequences of unplanned absences may develop assumptions about caregiving employees, not out of hostility, but out of experience, turning an overgeneralization into a structural stigma. The economic consequences of these norms are well documented. The motherhood penalty shows how mothers earn 5 to 7% lower wages per child compared to otherwise equal women without children. Carell's research isolates several mechanisms driving this outcome. Some operate through individual adjustment, so caregivers facing role strain, which is the difficulty of meeting the competing time demands of work and family, may voluntarily shift into less demanding, lower status, and more schedule flexible jobs that accommodate caregiving, which sacrifices career trajectory and wage growth in the process. Others operate through employer perception. Carell found that in experimental audit studies, between two identical resumes, the one that mentioned being a parent received fewer callbacks and lower starting salary offers by over $11,000, suggesting a significant portion of the penalty is driven by bias rather than actual productivity differences. In these experiments, evaluators rated mothers as less competent and less committed based on status cues alone, as seen in the figure, before any performance information was available. These results are paralleled by Raber et al., who looked at the distribution of the informal care wage penalty by comparing the hourly wages of caregivers to similar non caregivers, matched on educational level, age, partnership status, and number of children, to isolate caregiving as a differentiating factor. Perhaps most relevant to our project, Figure 4 of the same study further shows the correlation between the caregiver wage penalty and the number of caregiving episodes, suggesting that each visible deviation from the ideal worker norm compounds the professional cost over time. These patterns translate directly to caregivers managing a family member's medical crisis. If a mother is penalized for anticipating caregiving demands based on status alone, an employee who has visibly reorganized their schedule around a parent's stroke or spouse's cancer treatment faces penalties for demonstrated caregiving demands that are more concrete and harder to dismiss. This stigma is further compounded by the fact that caregivers have no culturally available response that escapes penalty. When mothers attempt to overcome these representations through increased workplace commitment, they are judged as either interpersonally hostile or less likable for violating the gendered expectation that they should prioritize family over career. Fathers are similarly harmed by the breadwinner norm, as employers often actively discourage men from taking family leave, leading to a distraction theory of discrimination where they are seen as unreliable or inattentive. Moreover, these representations clash with one another and inevitably stigmatize the caregiver, as they are either viewed as uncommitted to work or uncommitted to family. This stigma discourages the use of voluntary organizational policies as it is perceived as a lack of commitment to the employer. Ultimately, these cultural representations transform the burden of caregiving for a sick family member into a long term economic disadvantage, as caregivers either sacrifice their own health and economic stability or face the professional consequences of being labeled as a non ideal worker.